say that, today's session is one of the two experimental sessions. When, we're trying these different formats, so in an effort to attend accurately to the practical constraints of our current moment, and also to sort of just explore like different affordances of what Zoom can do or cannot do. Zoom apparently just forced us into an experience of fractured time. So there's that. But all in the hope to continue to foster a sense of intellectual sociality, even in this, I'm sure, very difficult time. And so today we have two very exciting speakers with us. And I will also say that a massive amount of gratitude to you both. I know that Cassandra has to teach, and I know that that Deborah, this is like end of a very difficult, end of a long day for you. So basically everybody moved mountains, so thank you. And so maybe I'll just introduce you both, and then you can, and then we can, and then maybe then yes, then we'll figure out in order. Okay. So in alphabetical order, Dr. Cassandra Harblay is assistant professor of anthropology at the University of Toronto, Scarborough. Her research is focused on the moral and cultural dimensions of disability as social difference. Professor Hartblay's book manuscript, Totally Normal, explores how the specific context of post-socialism in Russia produces particular configurations of disability as social difference, and how disability advocacy takes on different meanings across global contexts. Foregrounding the production of social norms in post-socialism, Totally Normal explores not only disability, but proposes new frameworks for understanding difference and injustice in global capitalism. And we also know that Dr. Harblay sort of tries to explore the ways in which ethnography, or how we think about ethnography, may reproduce ableism, and have produced and written a play called I Was Never Alone, in which her thinking on performance ethnography unfolds. So we're super excited, Cassandra, and looking forward to the conversation. And Dr. Deborah Kaplan is professor of performance studies at New York University, a Guggenheim Fellow. She is the author of Gender on the Market, Moroccan Women and the Revoicing of Tradition, Traveling Spirit Masters, Moroccan Music and Trends in the Global Marketplace, and numerous articles on sound, narrative, and poetics. Professor Kaplan wrote a bunch of other things, but in the interest of time, I would just maybe highlight that we read and were inspired by your edited volume, Theorizing Songwriting, and as well as a chapter from your Aesthetics of Proximity. And if it's okay, I will also say that Professor Kaplan's seminar on sound and sensibility way back when, X number of years ago, remains one of the most formative and inspiring experience in my life. So we're also extremely excited and super happy to have you. I guess we should go ahead and just, do you have a preference, either of you?
Do you, Cassandra, have a preference? Doesn't matter to me.
I don't know.
I'm sorry? Who would you?
Either way works for me. Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's see.
Flip a coin. Who would you like to go? Just pick.
Maybe I'll let you go first. That sounds great. Yeah.
Okay, fine. So I'm very happy to be here, and thank you, Em, and everyone, Anne, and everyone who has been, Jamal, instrumental in bringing this together, which is not an easy task across time zones, across formats, and you know, we're trying to figure out how to be an embodied human being at this moment where we are all in multiple crises, right? Not to put a negative cast on everything. In fact, there, as Mem says, I'm not crazy about the word affordances for some reason, just because it has Ford in it. But what it helps us do and think about the body, especially. So, you know, if you've read the Aesthetics of Proximity article, you know that I've been thinking about this this tension between proximity and distance, and in particular, I've been thinking about it in relation to my research, which is long-standing now, with Sufi women in the Qadiriya Sufi order in Morocco and France, and in particularly their worship practices, which consist of chanting the names of God in unison over and over, but which repetition gives rise to a kind of sonic instability, what sometimes sounds to the Western ear like dissonance. And that repetition and perceived dissonance also provokes a change of state, what they call a hal, a state of rapture, a kind of state of union, and in any case, a state outside the norms of human coexistence that we might call spiritual or, in any case, connected in a different way. And this has led me to ponder the role of affect in sound, which I'm sure I was thinking about when Em took that seminar on sound and sensibility, and her work was an absolute shining star in that seminar on Noisy Hut. So the sound of affect in sound, the role of sounds in close proximity, that is notes in proximity, tones in proximity, vibrations and sine waves in proximity, and what this kind of density of sound affects or changes in the human subject. So of course this may be cultural. I'm not suggesting that this is universal or scientific. I'm not a scientist by any stretch of the imagination, but I have been thinking a lot about the aesthetics of proximity. So what happens when bodies are close, and what happens when bodies are distant, right? And we are so in front of these questions right now. But I've also thought about this in terms of the sublime, because the reactions of the Sufi women to these aesthetics resembles a kind of rapture or sublimity. And so I read writings on the sublime, and particularly Kant, Schopenhauer, and their thoughts about the sublime, which were based on distance, right? The smallness of the human in front of the magnitude of a mountain or nature, in quotes, right? The sublime object, which dwarfs the human and causes sublimity. So then I thought, well, in fact, this is a different kind of the sublime that I'm studying, and this is the sublime based on proximity of bodies, of sounds, of aesthetics. So that's the background of this study. I've been trying to find correspondences between physical or material, sensate proximity, and a kind of affective or spiritual state. As academics, we love correspondences and the challenge when we try to create theories and when they sometimes do and sometimes do not work. I've also been reading and listening to Judith Butler and her wonderful talk. I kind of found it by accident at the Nobel Symposium in Stockholm. You can find it on the web. And she's also talking about proximity. She talks about the obligations of proximity and the ironies of the present moment. And this was before the pandemic. The ironies of seeing images of people suffering all over the world who are so far from us, who are so distant. And she says that this provokes what she calls an ethical engagement or an obligation of proximity in the present. That is, these images of suffering. And of course, this also, and she draws upon Susan Sontag's work, witnessing and regarding the pain of others, which I've also written about. this also gives rise to questions about technology, right? The role of technology in mediation and agency. You know, can we be agents at a distance? And what you read today, if you read the article, was a kind of meditation on those questions. But then the pandemic comes along, and we're all behind our screens. And we are all, in a sense, suffering at disproportionate levels in solitude, if we're lucky, if we can. You know, in fact, it's the privileged who now have the ability to sequester themselves behind their walls. And those who cannot afford to do so are much more vulnerable to sickness, suffering, and death. So with that as a background, I hope you don't mind if I read you the last 2 or 3 pages of the article that some of you have read for the record, since this is being recorded for those who haven't read it. Again, it's a conversation with writers on the sublime in the Romantic era, writers in social theory by Judith Butler most recently, and then ponderings on the role of proximity and distance in our current moment. And I also allude to Merleau-Ponty's notion of the flesh, an element, he calls it, that connects humans with the material world. But let me preface the brief written remarks by noting that in my classroom teaching right now, I stress to all my students, no matter what I'm teaching, that we're really only studying 3 things. We're studying racism, we're studying ecological crisis, and we're studying the pandemic. And we're doing it through the lens of our respective disciplines, our perspectives, our cultural interpretations, our bodies, but there are really no other things to focus on at the moment. And of course, those things are connected, right? Racism being at the root, white supremacy, colonialism, imperialism, which gave rise to the subjugation of the planet and populations, which has caused incredible ecological imbalances that now give rise to the pandemic. I know I'm not telling you anything new. So in a sense, to attend to anything else but these subjects is to be ethically irresponsible. And so I'm focusing my own thoughts on this, and I rewrote the end of this article, which was already in press but not in print, to reflect that. And so it's very recent in my thinking, and here we go. So as I finish this article, the world has changed. There is a global pandemic that has forced most people into their homes and apartments and out of the workplace. People are dying and suffering at racially disproportionate rates. People are also communicating across time and space with an ease unimagined just a few months ago. But this interaction is virtual, like now. Family, friends, and colleagues, artists, and audiences are now images and voices on a screen. As physical, embodied beings, we are distant, but we are socially proximate as cyborgs. The flesh of the world extends to the flesh of technology like a second skin. What happens to the body, however, its tastes and smells, its resonances and sensations in this new reality? Where and what is affect when bodies are absent one from another? If the aesthetics of proximity produce empathy and states of change, what happens in conditions of embodied distance? So, and here I make reference to my research with the Sufis. With the quarantine, the Qadariya Sufis began online liturgies every day with prayers for the healing of the religious and global community. Every single day, there was a liturgy. This allowed practitioners from all over the world to attend. Time zones and space were transcended. There was a difference, of course. Everyone could not turn on their audio at once to chant, as that would have caused pandemonium, hundreds of individual voices colliding over Zoom. So we listened to one small household praying and chanting, while others intoned to themselves in the privacy of individual rooms. Many people left their cameras on, so their praying could be observed if one scrolled through the faces. But the audio remained mute. Consequently, the dense mesh of voices, the aesthetic proximity was absent. The difference was palpable. Listening practices changed. It was no longer possible to respond to the vibration of other bodies. the familiar ground of intersensorial experience that usually accompanies the ceremony, no one went into rapture. There was no hell. Rather, the liturgy did what liturgy does. It brought the community into being. And for this to happen, a co-presence in shared time was necessary, even if bodies were distant, as we are today. In moments of confinement, mediated sociality, when accessible, becomes more salient. Collectivities and audiences show up live on the screen, right? The actual presence of the other in the same time and space of the platform is important. It affords a different kind of imagined community, not one of nation per se, but one of peer group, audience, and collectivity, whether based on religion or on performances of taste or disciplinary proclivity. Watching a recording asynchronically is not the same, insofar as there is no imagined time-space continuity between participants. Showing up live in the conterminous virtual realm is a signal of belonging and commitment, a tattoo on the flesh of fluctuating existence. Presence, even in virtual performance, is a requirement for the threading of bodies into a shared affective weave. But what is absent is also significant, right? The intersensorial thickness of flesh. So I don't know if you've read The Absent Body by phenomenologist Drew Leder, but he asserts that the body appears to itself most poignantly when it is sick. The body, he says, appears to itself in dysfunction. It disappears, D-Y-S. It appears to itself in dysfunction. Whereas humans may walk around incognizant of their embodiment much of their time, distant from their own experiential sentience, in sickness, the body is experienced as other than the mind, becoming an object of accusative awareness. While Leder also talks about this in terms of the discrete individual, it also holds true for the collective. The global pandemic has made the social body aware of its ailing materiality, its dysfunction. As institutions with insufficient hospital beds, as schools unable to respond to the needs of children, and the warehouses of our elderly in nursing homes and other things. The social and political body appears to itself most poignantly when it no longer works. This is also true of democracy, and all the more poignant in the examples of the Black Lives Matter movement. The murders of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Tamir Rice, and others were first seen and heard by the public in online videos, and despite the risk of COVID-19, people took to the streets. Right? The sick social body appeared to itself in the extreme dysfunction of structural racism, in videos that went viral, and the response was, and had to be, an embodied co-presence. Only such proximity forces an intimate encounter with difference that displaces the boundaries of the self-same, in this case, the United States with its unmarked and misrecognized racism. What Butler calls the obligation of proximity is this: an immediate and corporeal response. So why did the video of George Floyd's murder, so distant from the majority of its viewers, incite embodied resistance when those before it did not? Perhaps it was the iteration of Eric Garner's death knell, "I can't breathe." Perhaps it was Floyd's plea for the policeman to stop. Perhaps it was the murderer's challenging stare into the camera. Perhaps it was Floyd's calling for his mother, or the breathlessness of the pandemic as a backdrop. The combination of images, sounds, and his voice evoked an intersensorial density that triggered a collective trauma, a memory in the Black bodies of America that made the past a present and imminent reality, one that could no longer be ignored. Floyd's voice passed through the mediated form and straight into the heart. "I can't breathe, officer. Don't kill me. Please, I can't breathe." This voice, this plea sent people to the streets, raising their own voices, no justice, no peace, a call and response, a wave of affect surging from behind closed doors and screens into the public sphere of history. To be an ethnographic ear to sonic acts such as these, or to those of Sufi Muslim worship in secular Europe, it is necessary to resonate with the sound knowledge transmitted, and to witness, indeed to empathically experience, the disintegration of the self-owning, rational self of the Enlightenment, what I've called the juridical body, as it gives way to another, the sound body, a collective and affective sonic ontology. Audition, or listening, is a techne on this path, produced in part by the aesthetics of proximity, microtones, intersensorial thickness, social dissonance, and lingering in the space of discomfort long enough to resonate with the same. It is not the human as such that is annihilated in this encounter, but rather the conception of a consciousness limited to the body rather than extensive with the affecting flesh, the fleshly affect of the world. So that's the end of that piece, and we can either, I don't know how you want to proceed, if you want to discuss it after, or we want to pass on to Cassandra and have a discussion later, up to you.
Perhaps, thank you so much for that wonderful provocation. Perhaps if we could go on to Cassandra and then move on to sort of questions for you both.
Sure.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you, Deborah. That was really a moving and intense way to start off our time together. I'm coming to you from Toronto, Canada, which is the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River. And I want to acknowledge all the many homelands that we're coming from and occupying, and including the servers that are making this meeting possible. So I'll just talk a little bit about my recent projects, then I'll respond to some of the prompts that Emily sent along in the poster for this, in terms of what are we doing in terms of doing anthropology and ethnography now in this fraught moment, and also to sort of reflect on the idea of syncopation, which was in the title of this meeting. And I think there are some interesting resonances with what Deborah has just shared. So I understand that some of you were circulated a couple things that I've written. First, my article, Disability Expertise from Current Anthropology. And in that article, I'm talking about what I think can be called disability anthropology, a kind of space of coming together between the interdisciplinary field of disability studies and cultural anthropology. And I name disability expertise as one area for investigation under that banner, that is that it's both of interest to anthropologists as a theoretical and ethnographic object for investigation, and also in conversation with scholarship from disability studies, which as a discipline from its foundation is in conversation with disability justice movements, activists, and scholarship by people with disabilities themselves. Not that people with disabilities aren't among us in anthropology, but that is a founding premise of disability studies, unlike anthropology, where we so often rely on the super able body of the lone ethnographer in our sort of traditional understandings of what we do. Deva Kasitz has called it the cowboy ethnographer out on the range, echoing earlier scholars' discussion of that. But I'm interested in disability expertise as a kind of subjugated knowledge that is specific to communities of people with disabilities that seems to arise again and again in different situations and different cultural settings. And you also were offered a preprint of my book that is coming out later this fall with University of Toronto Press. And that book is called I Was Never Alone. It is a play script based on ethnographic interviews with people with disabilities in contemporary Russia. And in particular, I highlight excerpts from sort of life story moments with 6 key interlocutors. And they each sort of offer the audience a window into their world, and the audience plays the role of the ethnographer in the play. So similar to works by a variety of performance ethnographers, such as Sayuni Madison and E. Patrick Johnson, you bring the work of ethnography into the space of the theater so that the audience becomes part of that participation. And in that book, I also include a reflective essay where I sort of consider what it means to do performance ethnography specifically in relation to disability and embodiment. And the title of the play, I Was Never Alone, is actually a quote from one of my ethnographic participants. And I think I can share an image from the play, one performance of the play itself, if I can figure out how to do this.
I just made you a co-host, so you should be able to screen share as you wish.
Oh, great, thanks. I will try that. Yeah. Okay, so I'm just going to share this image. So in this image, 2 actors play characters in the play, Mama and Alina, an adult daughter with cerebral palsy, living together in an apartment in Russia. And in the scene, Mama starts telling a story to the ethnographer or the audience, explaining that she felt terrible when she would go to work as a janitor at a local school and leave her elementary school aged daughter at home alone in the apartment. And at that point, Alina interjects and says, "You're not telling it right. I was never alone." And in the course of rehearsing this scene, we had a kind of interesting discussion between Jason Dorwart, who was the assistant director and an actor playing one of the other roles, and Joseph Meagle, who was directing this staged workshop, about the specific meaning of that line. And it's a line that anthropologist Michelle Rifkin-Fish and I had discussed earlier when I first told her about it. And the idea, it kind of harkens back to Deborah's conversation about proximity, because here what Alina is pointing out is that as a person with specific physical needs, the kind of physical needs that mean you need assistance to get in and out of bed or on and off the toilet, she actually doesn't have the luxury of being truly alone in the way that others of us might be. And in that conversation in the rehearsal studio, Jason, who also has a kind of disability that leads to a similar sense of need in his daily life, said, you know, I don't get to be alone in the same way. So when Alina says, "I was never alone," she's not only claiming that she is a social being with complex networks of friends and relationships with the neighbors' children who come over and barge into the apartment and spend time with her, as she describes, but she's also saying that there's a kind of reality to being a person with a disability in relation to that kind of proximity. So I'll stop that share now, but I just want to offer that as one sort of reflection that comes out in that essay that's a kind of interesting provocation for us now. And I was thinking about the question that Emily raised in terms of how are we doing anthropology now in this fraught moment and the sort of things that have been feeling refreshing to me. I really enjoyed the recent SCA podcast, What Does Anthropology Sound Like, on poetry, where Darcy Alexander talks about the ways that writing in multiple genres at once gives us a kind of capacity to see our field work data from multiple angles. And that really resonated with me in terms of how I wrote the play. I was at once writing an ethnographic dissertation. Oh, I'm sorry you saw my desktop and not an image. I just saw your comments. I couldn't even see that. Well, I'll have to try again later. But so I really recommend that podcast. And then I also have been really thinking about the call from the recent panel called The Case for Letting Anthropology Burn with Jonathan Rosa, Savannah Shea, and Ryan Jobson and others about this call to renew and re-engage with the concern with ethical relations and the kinds of relations that we're holding with one another as ethnographers. And in that sense, you know, we've had the post-colonial turn, but there's this sort of new urgency in that conversation to really examine our relations that we're building through our ethnographic work, both in the university and with our research interlocutors in a different way in light of the current political struggles and reckoning of Black Lives Matter and so forth. And so I'm really kind of interested in holding that in the frame as we're doing ethnography. And I recently had a conversation with my research assistant, who's a PhD student in the theater department here at University of Toronto, about next steps for the play project. And we were talking about how could we possibly stage the play as a work of disability theater in this moment. And in some ways, people with disabilities, as I found in my fieldwork and discussed in the play, have really been relying on the digital as a space for a long time. But when we think about theater online, there's a kind of disappointment because that embodied co-presence that Deborah was talking about is so central to the theatrical experience, both for performers and other artists in the troupe and the audience. And so we were talking about what it means to imagine a digital performance where the frame of the Zoom meeting is part of the performance, right? That maybe the ethnography is taking place on Zoom, and that becomes a sort of adaptation of a script that was originally written for describing in-person ethnography. And so that's something that we're playing with right now, and it's just emerging and it's very new. But I think it actually addresses several problems that we've been having for some time, which is that as ethnographers, we're never fully separated from our field site in the digital era in the way that we maybe imagine ourselves to be or have been trained to think about arriving in and leaving the field. And, you know, we're still engaged with the social media presences of our interlocutors once we come home from the field. And that sort of taking leave becomes more fraught when there is the opportunity to be in touch. So one thing that we're thinking about with this possibility for a digital theatrical performance is it actually opens the possibility for research participants who have been co-creators of the script to also be co-creators of the performance in ways that something like a Zoom platform allows. So that trying to take the opportunities for distanced co-presence seriously as an opportunity for co-creation, not only in the moment of fieldwork, but then afterwards in moments of presenting and sharing the theoretical insights gleaned from fieldwork with broader audiences. And I think that's something that could be explored not only in a theatrical project, but in other ethnographic projects as well. So just to wrap up, I was thinking about syncopation and thinking about it literally. So I loved that as a title for this, and I found it really provocative. And I kind of went back to my elementary school recorder lessons and was thinking about, how we notate syncopation, that little dot after the note, and the idea of pausing past the beat and leaning into an alternative rhythm that creates a kind of altered temporality and also like a really particular energetic force in music. So if we were to run with this, right, maybe the energetic force of what drives the transitions between reading and fieldwork and data and analysis is shifted slightly askew in this moment, that we're kind of leaning on the last moment a little bit more and then hopping to the next thing with a little bit of a skip. And so maybe we can think about that as an opportunity to recalibrate not only like embodied co-presence, but the temporality of how we're engaging in ethical relations with one another in this digital moment of ethnography. And think about what are the ethical relations, to extend the metaphor, that are driving the melody of our ethnographic projects. So digital, distanced, this syncopated rhythm. It could become a mood, right? If we think about syncopated rhythm in musical history, it's a mood that defines certain historical periods and genres of music. So while we can't name our own historical period while we're thinking of it, I actually really like this idea of thinking about this moment producing a kind of syncopated ethnography. So I think I'll wrap up there, but I also have thoughts about temporality and what disability studies scholars call crypt time and how that might play into this idea of syncopation in other interesting ways. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Cassandra, as well for that. Indeed, I think sound metaphors are we're just going to lean into that at this point. Resonances abound. And so the ethnography workshop fellows have prepared a few questions, but we are also, we also only have about 10 minutes left. So if I could maybe put forth a proposal for everyone, which is maybe we can start off, if either speakers want to respond to the other, or if anybody wants to just go ahead and jump in with questions, we can do that, and perhaps we'll also go a little bit over with some of the fellows. But if anyone needs to leave at 10 o'clock, please feel free to do so. How does that sound? Great. If anyone has a burning question, please feel free to unmute yourself and speak up. And otherwise, one of our fellows will lead off with a prepared question.
Emily, since the fellows wrote up the questions, why don't we honor those and let them go ahead. They did the work on coming up with the questions, so rather than maybe start with those.
Totally.
Time.
Yeah, great. Cade, would you like to?
I would love to jump in, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you both so much for this fascinating talk and for the opportunity to engage with readings that are still sort of in the works, and to listen to you both speak this morning was fascinating and provocative. So thank you both very much. The question that I wanted to ask was, how might an ethics of empathy that is deeply imbricated in intersubjective affective experience be informed by disability expertise without making an object of it? Or how might someone without the ability to hear become included in the proximity of an affectively charged sonic environment?
Can we both answer? I mean, that's a disability question, but you know, I always, so I mean, Cassandra's welcome, I'm sure has a lot to say there. But I will just say that we all experience affect and atmosphere, right? So the deaf listen to music by placing their hands on woofers. You know, there are, music transpierces the body, and vibrations affect us whether we have working ears or not. So I think that it holds true whether we're hearing individuals or not in that case. I don't know what you think, Cassandra.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating question, and I think it is. Thank you for that, Kate, and also for that point about the vibrations and the experience of affect. Like, I think, in fact, Deborah's points in this presentation and article about the kind of shared altered state, right? That the experience of music has to do with how the sociality of the people listening changes. You know, to think of that experience as part of the experience of music, that sense of how the social space shifts is something that can be experienced with or without a direct experience of sound. And in terms of the actual ethical relations, there's a really important movement in disability studies, in disability justice activism, and in disability arts to see the opportunity of translating a cross-sensory difference as an aesthetic opportunity, as an artistic invitation and provocation. And so, for instance, Alice Shepard created a beautiful dance piece called Kinetic Light. And in addition to the sort of traditional modality of offering audio tracks for the blind to hear a description of what was going on stage, Alice invited poet Eli Clare and others to create alternate channels so that a blind audience member could tune into different channels and audio tracks, some that were sort of not objective, but near objective, right? Sort of literal descriptive tracks describing what was going on stage, and then others that were poetic engagements with what was happening on stage. And I think we can think about a similar thing in terms of how music is described. So for instance, I'm part of the Critical Design Lab, which has been hosting these online crypt dance parties as part of Kevin Gotkin's ongoing project at NYU, actually, on crypt nightlife. And as part of that project, there's someone who describes the music, and I am not particularly an ethnomusicologist or someone who has a lot of descriptive words for music, but I am always amazed by how enriching the kind of description of what the music is doing is in the sort of sidebar text box of the video screen. So I guess I would say that the way that we move away from a sense of pity is by leaning into the aesthetic possibility as something that is exciting and provocative for everyone, but also not to make it about everyone rather than the person who requires that translation to participate, but simply to say that provocation is extremely valuable. So thanks for the question, Kate.
Thank you both. That was great.
Cody, would you like to?
Yeah. Yeah. Again, expressing my thanks to both of you for taking time to speak on such provocative, thought-provoking works. And probably like Kate, I have a lot of questions, but I think kind of question that I have to kind of tie your two works together is this question of how might we as ethnographers enact more capacious conceptions of resistance and virtuosity in how we listen and witness the pain of the other. And I'm thinking of this especially when and if the other does not necessarily have the will or ability to vocalize their dissent. Yeah, I guess I'll kind of leave it at that, but how do we conceive resistance virtuosity when people may not be able to dissent?
Deborah, do you want to respond to that? I think this question about the witnessing the pain of the other is referencing the engagement with the Butler talk, right? Is that what you're intending?
Well, I mean, dissent is such an interesting word, and I teach Rancière all the time. You know, I love Rancière's work, and I also, by the way, I just have to get in this, I start all my classes this semester with The Ignorant Schoolmaster, which I highly recommend for deconstructing the narratives on which our education and higher education systems are built in terms of, you know, knowledge as a commodity and becoming emancipated learners, what he says. But anyway, that's a side note. How do we listen? How do we listen to dissent at all? And I mean, that was a very complicated question. I think that we need to institute practices of deep listening. I mean, by the time people are in graduate school, it's almost too late. But it's never too late. But, you know, these are practices we need to learn as children. Right, we need to learn how to listen compassionately and with empathy, and to like lend an ear and our body and time and space to the other. But certainly, you know, we can theorize them. It's easy. Practicing it is more difficult. But you know, people who have been living under totalitarian regimes, I'm living in one right now. You know, they're used to not being able to dissent in ways that are evident and in your face, right? But there are always ways to dissent under the radar. But I don't know if that's getting at your question. How do we listen to dissent, or how do we teach listening as dissent?
Well, I guess both questions could be applicable, but I guess I'm curious, like, what it brings up the question of what dissent actually sounds like, or if it exceeds in a sonic or all realm that is different than how we as ethnographers might actually conceive it. Like, how do we go about sympathizing, empathizing in ways that we might not actually register? So it's a somewhat lofty question, but yeah.
Yeah, but you know, it's to use the term of the day, and it may not be appropriate, but you know, it's about waking up. Right? So much happens under the threshold of consciousness, and we're usually not aware of it. So, you know, in terms of my pedagogy, that's what everything hinges on, is understanding making conscious what is usually not conscious. And God knows we are in front of so much dissent from so many angles and so many places right now, right? It's just noise, right? It's a lot of noise. And how do we breathe into that noise and discern where it's coming from, and what the plea is, and what the message is, and how to transduce it, you know? I love that you were talking about, Cassandra, translation from one sensory realm or aesthetic realm to another. I mean, that's what ethnography is about. Ethnography is about this translation into semiotic system. You know, Jacobson called it intersemiotic translation. We're constantly doing that, but we have to, again, make it conscious, and we have to become adept. That's our job. You know, that's our job as ethnographers. And if we are so needed, the skills of ethnography and the methodologies of ethnography are so needed right now, right? And so, I think that to train our students and to really embrace those methods of the ethnographer and bring them outside of our screens and our academic bubbles, for me, that's the most important thing. And I can't say that I have a long track record in it. And that's why, I so admire work like Cassandra's, which is a play, right, which is in another genre, which is breaking through the walls, which is taking ethnography elsewhere. It's so very, very important. But for our students going forward, I don't think that there's anything more important than teaching them ethnographic skills of listening and then how to take them out into the world, where an expanded definition of the field site.
I love that, and I also it took me a moment to kind of process the question. Thank you for putting it in the chat in text form. And I think what the question is making me think of is about a third of the way through my graduate disability anthropology seminar, we read Joel Robbins' piece, Beyond the Suffering Subject, where he takes up the idea of Truelow's discussion of the savage slot in anthropology, and argues that as we've moved away from studying, quote, savage as a discipline through all the necessary critiques of the racism inherent in that idea, we've, as a discipline, accidentally fallen into a pattern of studying the suffering of others, and that creates a kind of slot in our discipline where we are captivated by this project of witnessing and describing suffering. And Robbins points to kind of the problem with this, which is that it creates a sort of closeness to pity. We haven't escaped the problem of pity or of looking down to that was inherent in Truelow's excoriation of savage slot. And so in part, that's what I'm trying to do in thinking through disability anthropology that looks at virtuosity or expertise of people. Robbins calls for an anthropology of happiness, and I wonder maybe what we're looking for is an anthropology of virtuosity. And that's actually an ethnographic habit that has been around for a long time, right? To look at the expertise of people in their own worlds of what is the Scott phrase of managing your circumstances to your own minimum disadvantage, right? That there's a kind of expertise inherent in that management, in that negotiation, and that's something that, as ethnographers, we come to recognize as a kind of trick of trade. And I think it is extraordinarily important in order to not slip into that pity gaze.
Thank you both so much. Jin, I see your hand is up, but Jiyoon actually has also one more prepared question. So if it's okay for that one to materialize first.
And just before asking the question, totally different thing. I was in this writing pedagogy workshop and found it that one way to get out of the academic bubble that Deborah was talking about was to actually make connections on campus, for example, exchange students between classes, or making them write letters for actually actual policymakers and so on.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because like yesterday we were talking about why do we feel like we are in the bubble, and then we experience it's like campus is also a very effective space, right? We see just buildings we don't know, people we don't engage, and bulletin boards we don't read, So, I think it might be relevant to what we were talking about here as knowledge production and knowledge as a commodity. That I don't know, yeah. I think there can be more ways to do this, even through Zoom as well, to build effective spaces by connecting different communities. But yeah, that was just what I thought. And I actually have 2 questions left, but I think they are all related. So Yanping, who wasn't able to come here because she had a class, asked about performance in creativity in or as a striving toward and survival. Could we think about the creativity of surviving the ongoing disasters? And because I study families who are living amidst radiation risks after the Fukushima disaster, I was, equally interested in this question because I think definitely we need to witness and document suffering in a sense that there are always new forms of suffering, right? There's a fine line between objectifying it or ethnographizing it. I think it's a kind of task we all deal with as ethnographers. So I am dealing with the suffering of these people after the disaster, but it's not about survivorship. Actually, it's not about survivorship at all. It's not about the spectacular destruction. It's about everyday life that goes on with invisible risks. So there's a kind of loss and suffering there, but it's not as apparent as people would see from the images of tsunami and so on. Mm. So my question was related to, I'm going to read, both of you consider the body in network ways. The body-mind is intercorporeal and intersubjective. Could you elaborate on how the body is mediated, not only on the news or over Zoom, but also in ethnography? So through this question, I personally wanted to ask you two, because you two both are dealing with particularly vulnerable bodies, scrutinized bodies, with the gaze and biopolitics and so on. So how do you actually, what's your writing strategy to, not just for research, data collection, but to write about those subjects? Yeah.
Well, I'll jump in. I mean, that was really loaded. And, I would caution, I love Joel Robbins' work, but we are, doing ethnographies of happiness is all well and good, but we are in a crisis and we're going to be there for a long time. So I would caution against putting up defenses against that kind of thing. I believe with Jun that we need to witness and we need to be a part of. But of course, we also have to protect ourselves, right? There's this critique of empathy that we're getting too close. If you're empathic, I have to say, this is irresponsible of me to just repeat these ideas without having read the book. But I read the book review by this Harvard professor who was, or was it Yale, who was critiquing empathy and saying that we are too close to the empathic when we're being empathic, and we lose our objectivity. And you can be empathic to Hitler, you can be empathic to Trump, and and then it doesn't necessarily. It's not always a good thing. I hear that critique, but I also think we need to temper it. But we do also have to protect ourselves insofar as we don't, can't give yourself to the suffering of the world without becoming completely depleted. What is our role in being these witnesses? And so I love the question because because I'm a writer and because craft is so important to me. And I'm writing right now a memoir, and I don't know who knows if it will be published because it's not academic. But it seems in Laila Abu-Lurod's spirit of storytelling being the least injurious way we can do ethnography, it seems to me the form I need to take for this work. It's about Sufism, of course. It's about my ethnography, and it's, I hope, not self-indulgent. But the fact is that I am not writing it in an academic voice deliberately because of all the baggage that carries, right? But of course, I'm a senior scholar and I can do this. And again, I don't know if it will be published. It's harder to break out of these genres when you have a tenure committee looking at your, your publication list. But I mean, those are my thoughts on it. We have to continue to be empathic human beings, right? And we have to continue to be there. And transduce those emotions. And transduction is such an interesting thing in listening. It's the big metaphor now, because it takes one energy, a sine wave, it goes through the ear, it processes, and boom, all of a sudden it makes meaning. It's an electrical metaphor, right? It takes one energy, water, goes through the water wheel and produces electricity, right? So it's one thing going through another that then comes a third thing. this is what ethnography does. This is what listening does, but this is also what ethnography does, you know, and we have to do it, of course, with as much compassion and as much beauty. And this is where, you know, if we're going to study, if we have to study suffering, let's do it with beauty, right? Let's be craftspeople. Let's, if we're going to write, let's be writers that are good writers. You know, if we're going to be theater makers, let's be good theater makers. Let's do it beautifully. I mean, that's where the virtuosity perhaps comes in that you were talking about, Cassandra.
Thank you both. And thank you, Gio, and also to Yingping for the questions. Gio, I really like the way that you used the word scrutinized bodies, because I think it gives us a different way for grasping the kind of overused word vulnerable. So I really appreciate that phrasing, and I would like to hold that up and think with it some more. And I think that in particular, you know, it's hard for those coming from a non-disabled perspective to grasp the degree to which people with disabilities are routinely patronized by the sort of medical gaze. Mm-hmm. And we end up in a situation where too often there are rooms of people who aren't out as identifying as disabled, speaking for and about disability communities. And in that scenario, because there's such a stigma, particularly in academia, for describing our own body minds as fallible, we end up in a situation where the idea of scrutinizing particular body minds from outside of that subject position is really frequently allowing for a kind of slippage into that pity gaze, right? And so when I'm talking about virtuosity, I'm borrowing a phrase from sorry, blanking out here. A new book that's just come out called What Can a Body Do? By a disability studies colleague of mine who has this wonderful description of the fact that we often see people doing tricks on a skateboard and say, wow, I could never do that. And in that expression, there's a kind of recognition of virtuosity in using the technological device of the skateboard. Yet very rarely do people look at someone navigating a wheelchair on a similar slope and recognize that virtuosity. And so, oh, sorry, Sarah Hendren is who has made this point and written the book. And while it's critical, as Deborah's pointing out, to not only focus on those moments of virtuosity, but to be empathetic about all the moments of struggle in between, there is still a project of kind of reclaiming a capacity for virtuosity amongst communities. I particularly work on disability, but we could think about other communities that are understood to be vulnerable or suffering, but from a dominant culture perspective, and to reclaim capacities for virtuosity. And so the virtuosity is not necessarily that I'm speaking of, not necessarily that of the ethnographer, but that those virtuosities of our interlocutors that are related to subjugated knowledges. So yeah, I really appreciate the question about how body mind's getting mediated through all of these new platforms and the media itself, the news or whatnot, but also through our own ethnography comes about. And I don't know that I have an answer. I have a section in my play script where there's a character description where I very sort of matter-of-factly describe people's bodies. And some people love that section and some people hate it because they feel that it replicates a medical gaze or a normative gaze. But on the other hand, there's kind of movement in some spheres of disability advocacy to stop using euphemisms and just say what disability is, and to just talk about bodies matter-of-factly, because how are we going to address the stigma otherwise? And so I think for me, I often do feel caught there. And all I can say is, take the script back to the people involved. Let them decide how they want to be described. So nothing in my script hasn't been reviewed and edited by the people who the stories are based on. So I'm gonna also have to leave very shortly. So I'll turn it back to everyone, but I will probably slip out in about 3 minutes. So thank you in advance for everything today.
Yeah. Thank you both so much, and thank you, Cassandra and Deborah. So I think our time is indeed up, and I wonder if perhaps we'll call an end to this session. But maybe if Jin wants to vocalize his question, and Deborah, I saw your hand was up a little bit as well, and we could maybe leave that as a cliffhanger and leading into part 2 of our experimental fractured colloquium. If that sounds good. And once again, thank you. Thanks to everyone, but in particular our 2 wonderful speakers.
Of course.
Yeah.
I just have a little footnote, and that is, do we want to adapt? Talk about resistance, right? Talk about dissent. Do we want to adapt to this platform? Is this what we want? This is not what I want, right? So on one hand, this, we can come up with and pat ourselves on the back, and rightly so, for the creative ways that we deal and all the things that we're learning, but we have to do it with a spirit of critique. And this is, not that we'll ever go back to the new normal and all of that kind of stuff. No, we never will. But is this what we want? I want bodies in space. I want to smell my interlocutor. I want to be able to touch and feel them. And, I want to use the senses that I have been given. I know everyone is differently abled in terms of their sensory perceptions and abilities, but I just caution us to resist, not just, to resist this. Because whereas, I'm very flattered to be here, and I love to think with others, there's no more beautiful gift than to think and be in community and collectivity with others. Right, so but this is a moment where we have to question, what our motivations are, right? So trying to do like the Society for Ethnomusicology online, and trying to do every conference that we've ever attended online, and so we can have that online on our CV. I wonder where the room for dissent and resistance is here, and I think we're probably not exercising it as much as we need to.
Definitely. I think thank you so much, and I'm seeing in chat that there's certainly resonances, and I think perhaps that's like the perfect. I think that's the perfect end to today's session, and so thank you once again.
Thank you very much, Em. I am so delighted to see you and to meet you all, and feel free to reach out by email or other social platforms. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.